This is video number 3 in our 4-part series on how to reverse trauma's effect on the brain, in particular the prefrontal cortex. In video number 2, we talked about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, its responsibilities, and some practical, consistent daily things you can do to actually start rewiring that part of the brain. In today's video, we're going to talk about the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Hi, my name is Bissan Hawkins Jr. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, trauma specialist, and co-founder of Hawkins Counseling Center. And we did this 4-part series because I really wanted to give people some practical things they can do consistently in addition to seeing someone like myself. And then also one of my biggest motivators was to de-shame people. When you go through developmental traumas in particular, it affects your brain development and it leads to all these difficulties and, like I said, cognitive abilities, the way you relate socially, challenges in regulating your emotions. And so I wanted people to realize it's not their fault they struggle in these areas, but it's the impact of trauma on the brain, and then also give you hope that there's actually something you can do through a process called neuroplasticity to start rewiring these parts of the brain. So I want to condense that term down so it doesn't sound big and jargony. So the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Last week we talked about the dorsolateral. So dorsal just means upper. Think of like a dolphin or a shark. You got your dorsal fin, and then lateral is to the side. So it's the upper side of the prefrontal cortex. Ventro is the middle. Underneath, and then medial is the middle. So from this point forward, I'm just going to say vmPFC, so you know what I'm talking about is the ventral medial. So I want it to be understandable and digestible for everybody. So this part of the brain is really associated with emotional regulation and social interaction. So you can see when we have struggles or impairment in this part of the brain, how many challenges it really creates in your life. So in this video, we're going to talk about 7 responsibilities of the vmPFC and then 7 practical steps you can take consistently to create that neuroplasticity and help that part of the brain start to rewire in a more adaptive and effective way. Number 1 is emotional regulation. The vmPFC really helps orient us to things in our environment that are emotionally important and then mediate or modulate our reactions to that. So those are things like, could be recognizing somebody in our environment or something that has emotional importance, like maybe it could lead to a financial reward or better connection or an object I've been seeking out. So it pays attention. We have to selectively attend, they call it, where you have so much stimulation coming at you that your brain would just get so disorganized if it all came in at once. So we selectively attend and filter out the vast majority of the stimulus that's coming at us. So the vmPFC helps you really pay attention and orient to like emotionally important things. And then, like I said, it'll either enhance or help us come up with an effective response to that or inhibit ineffective responses to that. So maybe I get an unexpected bill or a letter from someone, and then my immediate reaction is an intense, like adrenaline, or I could get hit with shame or sadness or fear, and it helps me kind of regulate down, take a second look at that, maybe have a different perspective around it, start to problem solve. So if that part of the brain is impaired, then we're getting nailed in our ability to regulate emotions around some of these stimulus. And then we're compulsively reacting or impulsively reacting. We talked about some of that in video number 2, how it makes it, that part of the brain is really responsible for down regulating that initial reaction and being reflective or coming up with options. So if you struggle in this area, life can end up being very impulsive, chaotic, which leads to poor financial choices, poor relational choices, a lot of shame, things like that. Area number 2 is value-based decision making. So this part of the brain will really evaluate our needs, goals, perceptions, what's in alignment with my values when I'm making decisions. Am I conscious? I'm making like good reflective decisions about my actions, in alignment with that. So if I'm kind of, impaired in that, area of the brain as well, then I'm not as conscious. I'm making impulsive decisions or maybe things that are really out of alignment with my values because that part of the brain isn't slowing down enough to help me regulate and then reflect, where I can make sure I'm making good choices that aren't, or I'm not working against myself. So people, again, will feel a lot of inner conflict, a lot of shame, when it feels like, oh, why do I do these things? I really wanted this outcome, but then I did all this stuff. And it's very frustrating to someone. Area number 3 is moral reasoning and pro-social behaviors. So we just talked about value-based decisions, which is not morality, but just what my value structure is, whether it's freedom, security, adventure, fun, connection. Here, this part of the brain in moral reasoning is looking at, my internalized belief systems. What do I view as right or wrong? It's helping me reflect on that, long-term consequences of those choices. It helps me really kind of take in and consider others in those choices. So it has that's where a lot of our capacity for empathy comes from, where we can try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. How is this decision going to affect them as well? Is it in alignment with my core values morally? So I'm not stepping outside of that. And again, lots of guilt, shame, things like that. And it really helps us connect, inform social bonds, maintain those bonds through empathy and the ability to step in somebody else's shoes. Number 4 is really correlated to number 3, what I just shared with that, and that's what we call in psychology theory of mind. And so that's the capacity to really kind of take a step back and, based on somebody's actions or behaviors, not make judgments or assumptions, but that whether it's my own or theirs, I can kind of come up with a pretty good idea of maybe what they're feeling emotionally, what their motivations are, what their perspective is. And again, this leads to capacity for empathy, which is that ability for me to put myself in your shoes without judgment and really try to understand you on an emotional level. So you can see how in areas 3 and 4, if you really are impaired in these areas, it's going to cause massive relationship problems. You're going to have a lot of confusion about why I do the things I do. You're not going to understand others and what they do. And it's pretty common, even if somebody doesn't have developmental trauma, people I find really struggle in this area, that we don't get enough of what we needed to get high-level empathy skills. So people are often what I call making a statement that's guised as a question, like, why do you do that? So which is a synonym for you shouldn't have done that. And so it's hard for us to really, if you didn't receive empathy, I didn't get the experience of somebody really wanting to explore what's going on inside of me, understand it without judgment, get it at a deep emotional level. So when you're going through developmental traumas, the people often who were supposed to help me get this capacity were the ones that were annihilating my sense of self or neglecting or abandoning me. So then I never got this ability. So it doesn't mean I'm selfish or narcissistic. In many cases, I just don't know how to do that. It's a skill that begins with regulation. That's why number 1 was emotional regulation. But then, and that's one of the things we do in therapy, which I'm going to get to when we get to the 7 things that you can do. So, people will oftentimes, well-intended clients I have that have gone through developmental trauma will ask me things like, am I a narcissist or am I a sociopath? Because they may really struggle in this area. And kind of tongue-in-cheek, I say, just the fact that you asked the question would tell me you're not. Because individuals with those kind of wounds don't tend to ask me those kind of questions. So it's not that you lack compassion or care, it's just this part of the brain, again, is limited in its capacity to do this. And we're going to show you some things in a minute of how you can start to shift that. Number 5 is autobiographical memory and self-processing. So I'm going to define that for you. So it's the being able to kind of pull up incidents from out our history that have emotions related to them that were meaningful, or specific incidents that contributed to some of our identity. So what happens a lot when you've been through developmental trauma is there is either a shame-based identity, because you had a lot of different shaming things happen to you, whether it was neglect or abuse or bullying, different things like this. And then it's either that, or it's hard to construct a cohesive narrative of my history leading to a solid sense of identity. So when you have to split off and disassociate parts of myself or different experiences or thoughts or behaviors or beliefs because they were threatening in the environment or they were overwhelming, then internally I've got a lot of non-integration or fragmentation in the brain. So then I jump amongst parts of myself in my personality structure, and it's hard to have a coherent sense of who I am. So a lot of my clients that have had histories like that will have either frustration or anxiety with themselves, or I just don't know what I want or who I am or what my purpose is. There's just a lack of a cohesive identity. And then a lot of their kind of different internal parts of them, because they're not working cohesively, will get very internally conflicted, you know, and then clients will shame themselves, like, oh, I self-sabotage, or I'm my own worst enemy, I do all these things. And it's hard to identify what my purpose or calling or passion is when I'm not connected to all parts of me. And so again, they can be very shame-based, or lack of that cohesive sense of identity. And then big part of that is because this part of the brain is not functioning correctly to help me do that. Number 6 is emotional regulation in social contexts or situations. And so this part of the brain, the vmPFC, helps us read social cues, reflect, decide on how to respond to that. You know, it can help regulate social anxiety. So, you know, this is a huge one with most of my clients, where they're in an environment, but they're not adept at like social intelligence or emotional intelligence because of the impairment of this part of the brain. So this, you know, the vmPFC will help us come up with adaptive responses to those social cues, inhibit, you know, inadaptive or non-adaptive responses. So let's say, you know, you look across the room and somebody has a look on their face. You think either they're angry at you or they're judging you, and then you have this impulsive reaction back. Maybe it gets you in conflict. And I wasn't able to inhibit that or reflect or look at other possibilities. Well, maybe they're thinking, maybe they've got indigestion, maybe something else is going on with them other than the fact that they're judging me. So I don't have that kind of inhibiting capacity that the vmPFC provides when it's been altered through my trauma. So this is, I would say, number 1, the emotional regulation, and number 2, number 6 here, emotional regulation in social context are probably one of the biggest problems for people when you've got developmental traumas, because if you can't regulate, everything's off. And then if you can't manage social cues, reading myself, reading others, the theory of mind, my relationships are going to be all over the place. If I don't have that capacity for empathy, I can't ever resolve conflict with anyone. So it just, you see the contributors of how you just end up in worse and worse situations, either bitter, resentful, you know, feeling worthless, that don't have any good connections I've maintained for a long time. And it really comes down to, in your case, if you've been through these things, that my brain is just not working correctly. It's not a result of my intelligence, who I am as a person, my character. It is a brain thing. So if you get one message from these videos, really internalize that it is a brain thing. And I'm not assuaging all personal responsibility that we all have as human beings. And one of the ways you can take responsibility is by watching these videos, seeking help, working on yourself. And it is work, but the payoff is well worth it. And it really is your only option. But we can change the brain now. I'd hammer again the neuroplasticity thing. The last one, number 7, is autonomic regulation. So we have what's called our autonomic nervous system. I think in terms of automatic, it's controlling things like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. And then within that, you have your sympathetic nervous system, which are branches of the autonomic nervous system that take energy up, and your parasympathetic, which brings energy down. So you have maybe a fight or flight reaction or some level of sympathetic to address the stressor or the threat. Once that's done, the parasympathetic brings it back into balance. So when you go through developmental trauma, people tend to either get sympathetically dominated, so they're constantly in a hypervigilant state, or parasympathetic, where their system's shut down and overregulated, so they're very flat, numb, detached. Or you could go back and forth based on context, situation. It'll bounce around. And so then again, that part of the brain, the vmPFC, is responsible for regulating and balancing some of those states. And so, you know, we're going to get into now the 7 things you can do with the 7 facets of the vmPFC of how to start making corrections and work in this part of the brain. All right, the first area in making positive changes to the vmPFC is cultivating emotional awareness. So when things have been bad in the body, we tend to leave the body and leave the present moment, such as in developmental trauma. So one of the first steps to being aware of my emotional experience is getting reconnected with the body, what we call somatic awareness. So soma is another word for the body. So things that cultivate that, like, you know, just being mindful of what I'm experiencing in my body. You could journal, practice mindfulness meditation, psychotherapy, where you're really getting some assistance from someone like myself to kind of guide you, help you start to get curious of what I'm noticing, feeling in my body. And then I start to develop labels, words, where I can start to name my emotional states, which can be much more complex than people understand sometimes, because you could be, in reality, we think of words like anger, sadness, joy, fear. These are what we call categorical emotions or categories of emotions. But in real life, you're often experiencing many different states, which are combinations of different emotions and experiences and other neurochemicals. And so it's not so easy just to identify what I'm feeling in a moment. Sometimes it's very obvious why I'm feeling that. Sometimes I have no idea why I'm feeling this way, either really down or really frustrated and agitated today because I don't recognize like what caused that. So starting to explore this, noticing when I'm feeling the energy in my body, again, getting words and language for it. So I start to develop like an emotional literacy, which again can trigger shame for people, or there's a condition that, and again, it correlates a lot with developmental trauma called alexithymia, which I just don't have words for my emotions. And so then people in your life might get frustrated with you. What do you mean you don't know? Like, what do you feel like? I don't know. Like, what do you want to do? I don't know. Like, because they're really disconnected often from what they are experiencing, or even have an ability to communicate it. I mean, if you look at what happens is we get these implicit memories activated, which I've talked about in other videos. It's a bit like time traveling. So let's say you get this 7-year-old part of you activated that's kind of frozen in your nervous system from the moment I had to disassociate or block that emotional energy. And now when I access that, it's like my consciousness is back in that moment that never got regulated and never got verbalized. So of course it's going to be challenging to communicate that to anyone. So in therapy, what we're doing is trying to really slow things down, and with support, get access to that part or that network, help you regulate, where I can manage that energy to focus it within what's called an emotional window of tolerance. Then I can slowly come up with words for it, communication for it. So again, I would really like you to understand, when you're challenged in this area, it's not your fault. These were things that you experienced, that you suffered or victimized by at that time, but you can overcome them, and it's not a reflection of your intelligence, character, any of those things. And it just takes a little bit of work. So that cultivating emotional awareness is a big part of the initial step of this. Number 2, once you've developed some emotional awareness, is then we're working on emotional regulation techniques and strategies. So I just kind of referred to that a second ago. So you can do things on your own, like breath work. Breath work has become hugely popular in the last, I would say, 5 years at least. And so there's a lot of different types. I will teach my clients a lot of vagal breathing, which then activates the vagal nerve and calms down the sympathetic nervous system. And when you get proficient, you could probably do it in 1 or 2 breaths. It's the one aspect of that autonomic nervous system I referred to that we can actually take conscious control over, that affects the other ones like heart rate, blood pressure, is I can use breath work and breathing techniques to manage that. Also things like mindfulness meditation, progressive relaxation techniques, or whatever strategies, grounding strategies. A lot of therapies teach people that you can go on YouTube, emotional grounding, TED Talks. There's so much information out there that you can, expand on what I'm telling you right now that I can't get all into in this video, but the resources are there, access them, and just start working awareness, then regulation. Number 3, engage in social connection. And I know this may be challenging for many of you because there's been historical trust violations, and I'm not saying you gotta open up the doors and let everybody in. That would not be a wise decision either, but start somewhere. Go to a group and sit in the back and don't speak, or go have coffee with somebody. The vmPFC is so affected by social connection. My first job in the mental health field was working at a mental health hospital as a group therapist. And everybody in my group had severe mental illness, childhood trauma, addictions, and just people coming to the group every day, connecting, and some of the things we were doing with them, their symptoms improved. And their symptoms improved because it started affecting, in particular, the vmPFC. I remember other people at the center would come to myself or my colleague who we were co-facilitating these groups and ask us, what are you guys doing in there? Like, the clients are getting better. And these are people with chronic long-term mental health illness, and that's one of the reasons they're getting better is because it's making changes to their vmPFC. So things like practicing reflective listening skills, reflecting back to people, really trying to understand their perspective is going to stimulate parts of this part of the brain. Get involved in a team sport, a softball league, a bowling league, something where you're having, it doesn't have to be therapy all the time, it could be fun things, like some kind of group or volunteering or making a contribution, but you're doing it as a team, a team building thing at work, or, volunteering to be on a team of a creative team. All these kind of things really will help that part of the brain start to make different neural connections. Number 4 is dovetailing off of number 3, and that is practicing empathy and compassion. So you actually will create new neural connections and strengthen them through practicing empathy. And so like in therapy, we're providing or attempting to compassion, empathy, holding a safe space. You can work on these things of like, let me put some of my things temporarily on pause and really try to understand another person. Without judgment, what's their perspective? What have they been through? Why is this so significant and important to them? Reflecting those things back like you really get it. And you will end up being a winner as well as them, because it will strengthen connections in that vmPFC, leading to more and more of a capacity to do that. Number 5 is engage in value-based decision making. So, I would say this is conscious living. So sit down, and there's, resources you could use to give you a format or a template to reflect on my values. I remember doing that in my 20s, another time in my 30s, where I wasn't in a place that in my life, I wasn't making all non-value-based decisions, but too many of my choices and decisions were non-reflective, non-conscious. And I sit down and I remember going through a structure somebody had given me, where I really reflected, what are my values? And what's the hierarchy of my values? What are the long-term consequences of my choices? How are my choices affecting other people? How are they affecting my goals and desires? And so being able to do that, again, you're working that part of the brain, getting more and more of an ability to engage and do those things and become more conscious about your choices. Because again, working with so many people who've been through childhood developmental traumas, it just feels like your life is out of control. Like life is dictating to you. And it doesn't mean you're being a victim, and then maybe some friends and family have accused you of that at a time or judged you. It's just I don't have the same capacity or awareness or ability to do a lot of these things. And so my life just ends up being me going along for the ride, and I'm not taking ownership for my own power, not because I don't want to or I don't have the capacity, but I just don't know how. So some of these resources can really help you stop and think about it. And these are things that you are capable of doing and you will get better at. Maybe you sit down and I try to start it and I dissociate, or some block comes up, because I find that's very common as well. And then the person will feel more frustrated, more shame that they weren't able to do this exercise I'm advocating. So when they come see me the next week, I have no frustration with them, no negative feeling for them. I just want to understand what happened for them. Like when you left last week, you were fired up, wanted to do this stuff. Walk me through the minute you walked out of my office until it went off the rails, so we can see what's happening. And here's where you may need intervention or help with someone like myself. Number 6 is seek novel experiences, seek out novel experiences. So the vmPFC will really respond, neural networks will strengthen when you're challenging yourself cognitively, intellectually, emotionally, relationally, learning new things, experiencing new things, trying new things, explore new hobbies, travel, go to new restaurants. Again, these things are enjoyable, and I'm not, asking you to go do 50 push-ups. There are things that, are stimulating, and it will really strengthen this part of the brain and lead to a couple things that is very limited in most people who've been through developmental traumas, and that's adaptability and cognitive flexibility. I find when people have experienced a lot of developmental trauma, initially they are they're resourceful, they've survived a lot, but they can be very rigid. And some of that's because it gave you some structure to do things in this specific way, but then it becomes a bit imprisoning. So by creating newness and novelty, and it can be in a very positive way, you can increase your ability to have, let's say cognitive flexibility, where you have a problem and I come to it, rather than just getting locked in tunnel vision, I can take a step back, I'm open to feedback, I can think of potential other ways to address this, which makes me more adaptive, because life is complex and life is ever changing and evolving. So when we're stuck in rigid patterns, life is going to get very frustrating for us if we don't have some of that flexibility. The last area, number 7, is prioritize self-care. And I know this may be challenging for you because when you go through developmental trauma, a lot of feelings of shame and worthlessness get internalized. And so that leads to an often inability to value myself and have self-care. But if I do things like get good quality sleep, nutrition, what I put in my body, exercise, these promote hormones that enhance the brain's function, the cellular size, the communication between networks in the brain, our genetic expression, all these things are really important in healing the brain as you're doing the first 6 things that we talked about to make the neural changes, strengthen the neural changes, and then you're giving your brain the nutrition, the hormone fuel, the blood, the oxygen that enhance the ability and the time frame it takes to make these things happen. So the last 3 things I would add on is be consistent, be patient, and be self-compassionate. That this is a marathon, not a sprint. It takes time, it takes work. You can do the work, you can get to where you want to go. You can changing your brain. That when neuroplasticity first came out and was indisputably validated, I think it was one of the most amazing things that ever got discovered to give people hope and actually create transformation for them. Before, it was like your development happened, that's the brain you got, live with it. And so that was a very depressing, discouraging message. Knowing that you have the power to make these changes, and then again, seeking out help with someone like myself who can do these deeper processes for you and really clear the trauma from your body, help you consistently make those changes, clear out the blocks to making those changes, and then just being consistent. And I tell people 10% is better than 0%. So just do the best you can, be as consistent as you can from a place of patience and self-care. So I hope this video number 3 was helpful to you, or if anyone that you know or love or care about could benefit from it, please forward it on to them. Our whole focus here is just getting good quality information out and giving people some practical skills they can do to start to change and heal from what they've been through. So if you would like to contact us anytime, you can go to hawkinscounselingcenter.com and ask for either myself, John Hawkins Jr., or my wife, Bissan Hawkins, and we'd be more than happy to spend time with you, talk to you, answer any questions, or possibly sit down with you and do some of this work.